All right, Daniel, what are we talking about today?
Today, we're going to discuss planning for children post college, what workplace benefits should look like, and complexity for the sake of job security and financial planning.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. All right, well, you are defying Emily's tradition of making me think she's going to quit with her questions, but it does now worry me about how old you are and what planning you're doing post college. So you're going to have to talk to me about it. What is the question here? What are we supposed to be planning for with children after they leave college?
So, first and foremost, I don't have any children, and I'm not planning for them to be living in my house post college. They have to get to college first. So, no, this question's more geared toward, my generation and the people that I grew up with. I still have a lot of friends and family that are living at home with their parents. And we also have a lot of clients that have children who, we're having these conversations with. What does post college look like? Do you think a child is going to move back in, find a place on their own? Um, because not a lot of people move out after they graduate, and a lot of young adults will go back to their families. And there are financial costs associated with this. I don't think a lot of families realize. So I wanted to discuss some of those costs and how to really start planning and having those discussions with children.
Sure. To some extent, as we talk about this, there's going to be an audience member who is in this situation, whether they're the post college child or the parent with the post college child. But this discussion really starts before your kids go to college. It really even starts before they are applying to college. Realistically, I think the most important things to know about here are a combination of two theories. One is called signaling theory, one is called human capital theory. Signaling theory shows up in a ton of different places, but in the sort of education, post education context, it really shows up as a statement about what signals your education send off to employers. So, going to college is a signal, having a degree from college is a signal, having particular types of degrees from college is a signal. Okay, so that's just sort of the basic idea here. If you're an accounting firm and you want to hire future accountants or future CPAs, you are probably looking for a signal from applicants in the form of a bachelor's degree in accounting, or at the very least in finance or something in business, right? In human capital theory, the idea here is that we engage as human beings, particularly in a society like the United States, in a behavior that academics call dissaving, which really just means borrowing money. We do that to attend college in many cases, or as a family, we dissave by spending money on our children's education in order to equip them with greater human earning potential. And then they graduate from school with that greater earning potential, and then they're supposed to sort of leap off into that higher level of income than they would otherwise be able to accomplish or have a probability of accomplishing had they not engaged in the educational process. So, first and foremost, have I lost you on any of that?
No, I think I understand the two theories, but can you bring it back? I mean, what do they have to do with children post graduation?
Well, and most importantly, this is just the foundation for what I'm really going to talk about here. So, the first thing to understand when we think about both of these theories is what is the purpose of college? What is the purpose of an education? And there's all sorts of political commentary about like adult daycares or about just being a place where you can go and party and hook up and try drugs and drinking and all that stuff. Early on in life, sort of in a safe space. All of that is sort of beyond the point. When we think about this idea of the child who graduates college and whether they're going to springboard into their next opportunities or not, the biggest setup here before we get to the stage is what has been done in advance. So when we think about where the kid went to school, did they go to school locally and live at home the whole time to save on money? Did they go to school far enough away where they had to live in an apartment or a dormitory or something like that? And then what is the cause for them to return to the home? So because all this sort of filters into, I think, two very different versions of the same thing. There's example A. Somebody goes to college, studies we'll say something useful or beneficial that they are then going to have a good career in. But there's a little gap between graduation and when their job is going to start, right? They already interviewed, applied, got accepted, have an offer, but hey, your job doesn't start until January 1st or June 1st or July or whatever. And so you've got this, 1 month, 2 month, 6 month gap between graduation, let's say in May or December, and when you're actually going to start your job. And so you're just moving back for a little bit. And in that scenario, I don't know that there's a lot of planning really to be done there other than just sort of logistics. It's not a big financial question that really arises. But on the other side of that, there's a second case. And the second case is where those theories I discussed is a pretty big consideration. The second case is somebody who went to college, got their credits, graduated, or went to college and made it a little ways, and then for whatever reason, life happenstances, health, mental health, sickness in the family, whatever the case is, they've been forced to exit education. So they're a graduate, or they're on their way to being a graduate, but they're not there, and they're moving back, and there is not an exit plan established for that move back, right? So they're moving back because we're done with school, we're done with the educational process for now, and we're coming in back home to do something. And in some cases, again, you have a sick family member, you have a need or an obligation to come home to be part of your family, whatever the case is. But in other cases, this is a failure to leverage the value of the signals and the human capital purpose of an education. You have, let's say, studied something like dance theory, but you aren't very good at dancing. You are not very creative, and you've gone on and you've graduated, you got a bachelor's in dance theory, and now what? You did not spend the time in school getting the correct internships or having the right part-time jobs or attending the right networking events or applying to the right positions or so on and so forth to take that education and leap into that career field, right? Whether it's in this particular example, let's say ballet, musical theater, something like that. So consequently, you now have a huge capital burden in the form of your student loans or the money that your family has spent on your education, and you have not created the platform with which to leverage the human capital. So in that particular instance, this is where kind of the planning question comes in, because in scenario one, the planning is, hey, don't get in trouble before you start your job, move out, start your job, make money. Now you're a full adult, could go off and do great things. But in the second scenario, this is sort of a issue where we're really looking at a symptom rather than a cause. Okay. So when I talk about planning in this particular context, if we've gotten all the way to this particular scenario, the person who's, kind of the stereotype, right? The guy, the 25-year-old living in his parents' basement sort of scenario, one of two paths can be led from there, right? Path number one, this goes on in perpetuity, which is not a great solution, but it happens literally all the time. Or path number two, we need to do something to reset. Whatever we did on the first iteration of this educational process did not work correctly. We did not engage with the educational process as a process of developing adequate signals to gain greater occupational or career potential, and our human capital is being squandered. And so we either need to get really serious about getting out of that position, right, and finding gainful employment somehow, or we need to go on to graduate school, go back to college, whatever is necessary to improve the human capital prospect, right? And so instead of that person studying dance theory, they need to go back and study finance, or they need to go back and study business, or they need to go back and study biology, physics, something that has more of an applied science to it so they can gain more useful employment in that circumstance. But again, this is symptomatic. There really is a bigger, much bigger conversation we had about the cause of that problem.
Right. And like you mentioned, it's not, by the time you go to college, it's not already too late, but the conversation should have taken place already and the expectations should have been set. So for a family, say they have a 15, 16-year-old in high school, they're gearing up to take their SATs, and college is something they are thinking about in the future. How can these parents and adults start to have these effective, conversations with their child and start setting those boundaries for what college and post-college starts to look like?
I think I'll explain this sort of in the way that I often will explain this to clients who are, I'll say, open to hearing it. One thing that's important as a financial planner is not to tell your clients what to do in this particular circumstance so much as to understand what their beliefs and philosophies around college are, because you have parents who had their school paid for, you have parents who've paid for their own school, you have parents who are still paying off their own student loans. And so their beliefs about whether they should pay for their kids' school or not and so on vary quite a bit. But assuming that somebody wants to hear it from me, the general guidelines I would give around planning for college include a couple of elements. Number one, look at your children and never tell them that college is paid for, right? You can be saving. It's not to say you shouldn't put money in a 529 or a covered L or be setting cash aside to help your kid go to school. Our entire financial aid system assumes parents will help their children. So you can't just say, I don't want to help and good luck, kid. Let me phrase, you can. That's just a very poor thing to do for your children. Now, beyond that, right, the reason for that is because you don't want your children to just be like, okay, I don't need to apply for scholarships. I don't need to think about the cost of college seriously. I don't need to think about the return on investment very much. I'm just going to get to go to school and it's going to be free and it's going to be wonderful and I'm going to have a great college experience. That's all lovely, but that's not setting your child up to think seriously about the value or the potential for their education. The second thing that arises then is the quality of the education versus the cost. Some colleges are now exceeding $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year to attend, and not all of those are top tier schools. There's a lot of times that kids want to go out of state. They want to go off on the grand adventure. So you live here in Colorado and you always wanted to go to Florida State, go Gators, right? Or you're a big fan of college football and so you want to go to an SEC school. That's all well, great, and good. But the question here becomes, is it worth then paying an extra $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 a year to go out of state versus in state? I think it is important or valuable to go to a top tier school if you can get into a top tier school and if you can afford a top tier school, if your area of study is buffered by that top tier experience. So let me give you an example. I do not think it is worthwhile for somebody to go to Harvard to study something like English or philosophy. I'm not saying anything about the quality of English or philosophy as an education or study. I'm saying that your education in English or philosophy at Harvard is not special. Harvard is not known for being a great English or philosophy school in such a way that it will propel your career forever forward, such that it's worth paying 3 times as much as a 4-year state school. But I do think it would make sense for you to move to Massachusetts to attend MIT if you want to study something like electrical engineering. Okay. So if you're going to pay a premium for your education, there needs to be a premium return on it. You should not be paying a premium for what is otherwise a commoditized good, right? So you shouldn't go to Louisiana just because you really like the colors purple and gold. You really need to have a much better reason for going there. Okay. And then by extension, as you engage your child in the educational process, it behooves you to make them very aware of the human capital purpose of this enterprise. A lot of people go to school to study something they think is interesting. Okay. And I'll use myself as an example here. I studied history and poli-sci in undergrad. I read a lot of really good books, had a lot of really great conversations. And the life skills I gained from that were the ability to read really, really fast and to write a lot. Notice that I am not a professional reader. Notice that I am not a professional writer. Okay. These were not the best investments of human capital. Okay. In turn, right, if somebody wants to study something like engineering, physics, mathematics, or even something in the arts, as long as they intend to pursue a career in that particular field, that's fine. But there's a lot of people who go to college and pick a major based on sort of just what they think is interesting. And that is a bad investment. That is not a good use of time. I would look at anybody who wants to get a history degree and say, hey, did you know you can read the books without paying for the classes? Right? And it would just be the honest take I would give in that particular context. But recognizing that at the end of the day, it's a human capital decision. And so as parents are planning to send their kids to college and as kids are planning to go to college, being very realistic about what this actually is. This is supposed to be a place where I build my human capital, create a network, gain experience, and leverage that into career opportunities to improve my life in the future. And if you don't take both classes seriously, but also the career building elements like internships, like externships, like professional networking and mentorship events or activities at your school seriously, you are heavily squandering it. And that's how you become scenario number 2 that we discussed earlier, where you go to school, you have a great time, you get a degree, but you have no career potential from it, and you end up back at home trying to figure out what you're going to do next.
Those are great points, Dan. And I think we see that, or I personally have seen that a lot. A lot of my friends or people that are in a similar age range to me, they look at all their friends, and most of their friends, they're going to college. And, they think to themselves, well, maybe I should go to college. And, I remember my first year at college, one of my professors asking everybody in the class to tell them why they were here. And it was one of my favorite experiences from college because half the kids said, I don't know. I'm here because I'm here. I need to do something with my time, and I think being more intentional and having those conversations early in life can prevent you from falling into the second group and being a little smarter about your money. And I think one of the best points you made there that I thought was very interesting was how you shouldn't tell the kids that you're saving for their college. You can save for it, but if you put the onus on them and make them think a little bit that, hey, if you want this is going to be something you're going to pay for. I think that allows them to understand the value of the dollar a little bit more and, maybe pay a little bit more attention in class as well.
It really would go a long way. I mean, I even say the same thing in the class I teach at CU, which is, look, this is a class to learn a skill and apply a skill. It is not an easy class by its own nature. So if you want an easy class, I would suggest taking a different class, because this is a class where you are going to have to work really hard to pass, because it's a difficult subject to master. And for any student, I think it behooves them to think about their entire education through that same lens. What am I actually getting out of this class? Am I just here for the credit hours, or am I here because there's something that I can gain from this and leverage to improve myself and improve my future prospects?
100%. I mean, even comparing it to my golf game, I think my golf game improved significantly the day my dad made me pay for my own clubs because he said, Daniel, now you have skin in the game. So if you want these clubs to, you want to get the most out of them, they're on you now. They're on your dime. And I think college and even other things in life probably follow a similar suit.
One can only hope.
So, like I said already, Dan, I don't plan on leaving the firm, but I do think it's also important for people to look at their workplace benefits, whether they're graduating college and getting their first job, or if they're transitioning firms, in the midst of their career. And I think a lot of people, they know they should look at the salary. They know they should look at the 401k, and some of them, then they also think about the PTO and time off. But I think that's it. I think a lot of people stop there. And I really think and believe that there are a ton of other benefits that people should be investigating in depth as well. So I wanted to talk about, what those benefits look like and how people can start to look at them. So if you don't mind, what are some of these other benefits that you think people should be looking out for?
Well, I think first and foremost, there's a question about how you evaluate benefits versus salary. There's been a bunch of studies recently that show, particularly amongst groups like Gen Z, that a lot of students, a lot of young career professionals are really taking this sort of show me the money perspective around compensation. They're saying, hey, I want salary, and everything else is just sort of squishy. And there's a lot behind that. I don't want to get too much into the weeds there, but I think it's important to recognize that benefits are different than pure salary, pure compensation, and that many benefits are a direct replacement for it. But the fundamental thing to understand is, all things being equal, right? In a similar cost of living situation where, let's say, $50,000 of income is adequate to live, there is a material advantage to having a position that, let's say, pays $50,000 salary and then pays $10,000 in benefits, versus a situation in which you are paid $60,000 salary and no benefits, because fundamentally then that's $10,000 of taxable income, whereas benefits don't generally get treated in the same way. So first and foremost, there's just not all dollars are equal. Not all benefits and compensation are made equal in that sense. Getting past that point, though, and just thinking about the nature of the benefits, the first thing I kind of caution business owners around when they're hiring, as they're thinking about how they create a compensation philosophy for their employees, and in turn how they're going to attract employees to their company, is the question of who is paying and why. What is the compensation philosophy for the company? So, for example, many business owners will forego health insurance, right? You're not required to, as a business, offer health insurance until you have at least 50 employees. So many business owners sort of say, cool, I'll check that box when I get there, but until I get there, this is not my problem. In that particular light, what they're then signaling to their potential employees is, I am going to make you pay for this. So in that same scenario, right, $50,000 salary, $10,000 benefits versus $60,000 salary, no benefits, you're telling the $60,000 employee health insurance is on you. And in a certain free market sense, that can make more or less sense. But for something like health insurance, it is heavily age dependent. So it may not be a big expense for you early in your career, but health insurance is one of the biggest, scariest bills that people over the age of 50 are paying for. And even as you get into your 40s or if you have a family, it can get very, very expensive. So health insurance is just sort of a basic and obvious thing. A retirement plan. This one I actually emphasize probably more than almost anything else other than health insurance early on for people getting into their careers and evaluating benefits packages, because there's an enormous amount of behavioral finance research that would suggest that essentially what people do early in their careers is whatever their employer tells them to with retirement. So, for example, if you go work in the St. Vrain Valley School District here in Longmont, Colorado, and Boulder County, you will participate in PARA. You have no choice, right? If you are a teacher, you will pay into PARA. PARA is going to cost you 8% of your paycheck. It's a replacement for Social Security. Go straight into PARA. You don't have any say in it otherwise. And so you just do that. You just participate in PARA. But the same school district also offers a 401k plan and offers a 457 plan, which means today you could potentially be putting up to $46,000 into retirement. The only drawback is they don't match. Right, so these are just two big savings opportunities for higher earning teachers or teachers who have a spouse with a higher income that they want to help offset. And what I typically see is the vast majority of teachers in the district only participate in the para pension. They do not participate in the 401k or 457, despite how good those plans are for them to participate in, because the employer is not incentivizing it. They are not auto-enrolling the teachers in it. They're not making them put a mandatory contribution into it, and they're not incentivizing contributions through matching. And so the bodies of research out there suggest that despite the fact that I think everybody, I almost want to say everybody at least, or the vast majority of Americans have been beaten with a message that says save early, save often, put money away for retirement, so on and so forth, a lot of people will take their first job, and if that first job doesn't have a 401k or doesn't offer a match or doesn't auto enroll them or whatever their plan is or isn't, they will do whatever the defaults are. And that has a huge rippling effect. Your earning potential right out of high school, right out of college, is some of the most valuable retirement saving you will ever do, right? The money you save at 18 is the most valuable money you'll ever save in your lifetime. The money you save when you're 19 is the second most valuable. The money you save when you're 20 is the third most valuable, and so on. And so these incentives around something like a retirement plan can seem kind of squishy, like, well, I just got my first job and I'm not going to be 60 anytime soon, so like I can come around to that later. But there's just an enormous difference in the amount of wealth people build if they can start as soon as possible, and therefore if they're incentivized to start as soon as possible. So take my $50,000 salary, 10,000 benefits, or $60,000 salary example. If part of those $10,000 in benefits is, let's say, a 5% 401k match, and so that person is putting in, $2,500 just to match it, and they're saving $5,000 a year between their 5% and their employer's 5%, they are going to be heads and shoulders ahead of their cohort, right? That other person making 60 who doesn't have the retirement plan, who doesn't start saving for another 2, 3, 4, 5 years until their current job adopts a retirement plan or until they take a different job that has a retirement plan. And that difference could be in the hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars over a lifetime.
We have unlimited PTO here at My Wealth Planners, and I think it's a wonderful benefit that people can take advantage of. However, I think that varies on a firm by firm basis. It's like you mentioned, a squishy benefit. How do you quantify unlimited PTO? Because I can't take every day off, but there is some benefit there. How do you start to weigh that against other benefits when it's not that concrete?
So there's an interesting thing here, because a lot of studies show that people who have unlimited PTO policies take less time off than people who have fixed PTO policies. And that is sort of a everybody wins, everybody loses proposition, because on one hand, the benefit to the employer is supposed to be that you don't have to track PTO days, you don't have to pay out accrued leave when somebody leaves the company, so that kind of solves your bookkeeping issue there. And in turn, for the employee, hypothetically, you're supposed to be taking more vacation, right? Because it's supposedly unlimited, but it's not. I think the balance there is what I like to call the rock rule. And this is just an example that I give to business owners when I'm advising them around whether they should offer unlimited PTO versus have a limited amount of PTO. there has to be a definition of what constitutes reasonable within the boundaries of the culture of the company and whether it is or isn't reasonable to take more or less time. So, the Rock example is this: as a financial planning firm, we ultimately base our pricing around assets, around net worth, right? The financial means of a client, and so on. So, the Rock example is this: if you, Daniel, came to us on day one of your employment and said, "Hey, so excited to be here, excited for the opportunity. I just want to let you know, though, I'm actually really close friends with Dwayne the Rock Johnson, and he would like to become a client." Well, at this point, I have to assume the Rock is either close to being a billionaire or is at least has several $100 million to his name. That would make him an enormous client, well beyond any other client this firm has ever worked with or had. And in that scenario, if Dwayne the Rock Johnson actually became a client of this firm, not only have you paid for your position many, many, many times over, right, going forward, but also at that point, from a productivity standpoint, from a value to the firm's standpoint, the question of how much time you want to take off is sort of a moot point. You could come in on day one, say, "Hey, I've brought in the Rock as a client," and then say, and starting on day two, I'm going to be spending the next 364 days playing golf. I'll see you next year. I'm going to bring in Bradley Cooper next year. Good deal, good conversation. And even if you don't bring in Bradley Cooper, I think you've more than paid for yourself. I think it's more than reasonable for you to take that time. In other companies, then, as we think about whether we want to offer unlimited PTO, or as employees, whether we think unlimited PTO is actually a good benefit, or whether we are secretly concerned that our company is going to just say no anytime we try to take leave, or is going to cut us off around 2 weeks or 3 weeks, there's a couple boundaries or a couple things to understand, particularly in the interview phase. Number one, is there a minimum leave requirement? Hey, you say you have an unlimited leave policy. Are we required to take at least 2 weeks, at least 3 weeks a year to make sure we're getting some good use out of that? Or number two, what is the approval process? What is the default position? Do you just say yes by default unless there's a conflict or an issue? Is it just a matter of runway and foresight, right? You have to just let me know a month, 2 months, 3 months in advance, and then you can take off however much time you want. What constitutes reasonable unlimited paid time off here? What are the sort of things that affect the boundaries of that benefit?
That's such a good framework for questions. I think that a lot of people can start to use in interviews because, like I said, and like you said, it's hard to quantify. But if you can actually ask them, hey, what does the process look like for taking some of this time off, and how much time off, if any, is required for me to use? I think that's a really good place for people to start having those conversations.
And within the boundaries of something like limited pay comes up a conversation about something like hourly pay versus salary pay. I think fundamentally the alignment for something like hourly has to revolve around being paid for your availability rather than being paid for your outcomes. So front desk receptionist, a call center worker, a security guard, a cashier at a grocery store, these all make sense for an hourly standpoint because we need coverage, right? We need a certain amount of time on the clock covered. And so in turn, unlimited PTO can become problematic because we're then sort of trying to tie their time off to an hourly rate, but then we're also not getting the benefit of their coverage, and that's a little bit challenging. But in particular, like professional services, law firms, accounting firms, engineers, softwares, we're all results oriented. It's all about getting things done. It's about creating outcomes. And so I think creating a compensation philosophy on the owning side or the managing side, and in turn having a conversation as an employee about the acceptable and expected outcomes and the flexibility afforded to you in how you accomplish those outcomes is a really good way to have a conversation about it. Because at the end of the day, any employer on earth wants to hear an employee who is interested in aligning their incentives with the incentives and the outcomes desired by the firm.
All right, so Dwayne, if you're listening, we'd love to hear from you and see if we're a good fit. So I think that's a good place to leave it here, Dan.
Daniel would really like his 364 days of golf.
So I wrote this quote down here from this guy that apparently is pretty smart, Albert Einstein, saying that everything should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. And I think that's a really nice quote for today's last topic, which is complexity for the sake of job security in financial planning. And for us, this is something we hear a lot, but for a lot of families and folks, they might not be familiar with this phrase. And it specifically pertains to financial planning and adding unnecessary confusion to create barriers between the advisors and families so that, the family perceives value than maybe more than there actually is. And I wanted to talk about it a little bit. Where do we see this, and what are the main drivers of complexity when it comes to investment management or financial planning?
So first and foremost, I think the term complexity for the sake of job security and financial planning is a really interesting framework because you do see quite a bit of that. Ironically, in I think firms or in practitioners who do the least, and in turn, I think you see a lot of imposter syndrome amongst financial planners who do absolutely the most above and beyond effort and work and so on. There's an observation by a consultant, and I'm getting this story secondhand, but the consultant sort of laughed and said, everybody in your industry charges for the commodity and gives the value away for free. And what they meant by that is everybody charges for investment management and gives away financial planning. And that's sort of a norm for a lot of firms out there. All of this to come into sort of the core of the question here. I think complexity for the sake of job security in investment management shows up in complex portfolio construction, highly active portfolio management, or in the use of strange derivatives, alternatives, private equity, etc. There's a research element or a sort of question in the area of academia called the stock holding puzzle. Stock holding puzzle succinctly observes that the best returns on investment have come from broad stock market exposure over the decades. It's been well established essentially for centuries now that ownership of public companies, the biggest and best companies out there, and some small and emerging companies that are in the public market, over the long term has produced the best investment results pretty much for everybody, and that at least in terms of people who day trade or the singular Warren Buffett of the world who can actually sort of actively manage his way into a fortune, that is such an end of the distribution anomaly that it's not even worth trying to emulate because there's only one Warren Buffett, right? It's just not a reliable way to build wealth. But there are many firms out there that will essentially try to dress up investment management as being much more complex than it is. When clients ask us, how are you going to manage my money? What are you going to invest in? We give them a pretty honest answer in the inverse. And we'll even say it as bluntly as this. We will say, right, we're going to invest your money in broad-based index funds, exchange-traded funds specifically, that mirror various indexes and measures of the U.S. stock market, the U.S. bond market, or international markets. And they will essentially go up and down with the health of their particular index, their particular sector of the market. If you invested in the exact same portfolio, exact same way that we did, you would do better than we would simply because you wouldn't have to pay us to do it. However, that relies on having the time, energy, and enthusiasm to do so and do so accurately and correctly, and also having the discipline to stick with it over time. So in that, if you're going to hire us or have us manage your money, you're doing that for convenience, or you're doing that for peace of mind, not because you expect us to generate great excess amounts of wealth. And that is a statement of simplicity as opposed to trying to create the illusion of complexity in terms of investment management. In financial planning, I think this is where we get into a territory where fundamentally 90% of people's financial plans are, I don't want to say quite copy paste, but essentially it's sort of like building a chair by hand. If you've built one, you've built 10. If you've built 10, you've built 100. If you've built 100, you've built 500, and so on. Most elements of people's financial plans, how much homeowners insurance they need, how much life insurance they need, how aggressive or conservative they should be in their portfolio to accumulate wealth towards reaching financial independence, or how much income they should be distributing from their portfolio. A lot of that stuff is pretty uniform. It's not necessarily identical. Everybody's facts and circumstances are a little bit different, but in the context of retirement planning or investment planning or financial planning as a whole, most of the complexity really for anybody is going to come down to a couple of particularly niche areas of their individual financial life. Maybe you have equity compensation. Maybe you have a sick parent you're caring for. Maybe you have a child with a disability that you're trying to establish sort of a special estate plan for, or maybe you are 15 years older or younger than your spouse, and so that age difference creates a different set of expectations around retirement and the costs of healthcare, so on and so forth. And so individually, financial planning can often be pretty uniform, again, across 90% of the plan, but the devil's in the details. And that last 10% really becomes the area where you have to do quite a bit of heavy lifting and understand where the genuinely complex elements integrate. With that said, for some people, that's a solvable problem, right? You can iterate a plan, solve that 10% area that's unique to that individual, and they may not need financial planning going forward. If that problem is solved, their situation may be simple enough to just sort of carry on following a particular path. For other folks, that 10% problem never goes away, and it has to be iterated on over and over and over again. And the complexity arises in how things change over time as relates to that problem. And so to wrap it up here, because I've talked for a long time, complexity for the sake of job security and financial planning emerges when someone tries to convince somebody with a one-time solvable financial planning problem that they have a continuously iterating financial planning problem, and doesn't have the integrity to say, hey, I'm not really adding any value anymore. But they're just looking to collect on the fee, where frankly the person may be okay without that ongoing guidance for a while.
Great. I think another part to this question isn't, the folks out there who are adding complexity for the sake of job security, but I think another part of it is just us as planners sometimes being too complex with clients, whether it's just explaining something or a diagram or something that we're showing them. So for this last question, I wanted to push you a little bit. I think an important part of our process is reflecting and looking at what we're doing with clients and how we can always iterate and improve. So with that same token, what do you think we might be doing that's a little too complex, or that we just add, more complexity than necessary with clients in our process?
I think it is sometimes in the areas in which we challenge clients to simplify their expectations. And when I say that, I don't mean you're not going to get to retire, you're not going to get to do what you want. But it's sometimes in really pointing out that somebody will be okay despite what we do for them. So you'll hear me say it sometimes in initial consults. You'll sometimes hear me say it to existing clients as part of our quarterly meetings. And we'll just sort of opine or observe, hey, if you just keep doing what you're doing right now, it'll all work out. I think you'll be fine, unless you make a big mistake or a big deviation. And I think that can sound like trickery unintentionally, right? When you tell somebody it's, you'll be fine, I think some people can find themselves in a position where they look at that and go, I don't trust that, right? It just doesn't seem, it's too good to be true. And so, I'll even give a shout out to somebody who I know is going to listen to this at some point. We have a client named Carl. Carl's a great gentleman with a great family. And when he started his planning process a couple of years ago, he was very clear when he started the engagement, hey, I think I'm going to do this for just the year, get my plan established, get my baseline in order. And I think then we'll be done after the year. And going on now a couple of years, when we had the most recent renewal conversation, he made the point, I do recognize that I'd probably be okay and that the model is probably fine. And you've been very clear about that. And I didn't think I was going to want to continue this relationship because I thought, just building the plan would be good enough. But I found having a conversation partner, somebody to really work through and think about this and iterate through this, has been one of the most valuable parts of this that I never would have expected. And I think that is sometimes a strange version of complexity, where the value in financial planning often comes from the habit, not necessarily from the activity itself. It's about going to the gym over and over and over again. It's not about how heavy you lifted that one time.
I can continue my golf comparisons all day. But, I was at the range the other day and someone was asking me, hey, you got a nice swing. How'd you do that? And I said, I just show up very consistently. And he was, he's like, well, is it a club? Did you get a new this or that? I was like, no, I come to the range pretty frequently because it's doing the boring things consistently. It's simple, but simple doesn't always mean easy. And I think that's a really good place to leave it off here, Dan.
I would agree, but yeah, I will never ever let you off the hook for the final question of the podcast, which is, Daniel, it has been a few weeks since you've been on the podcast. What has it been that you have learned or gained or found the most interesting since you were last on the podcast that you'd like to share with the audience?
I think I might have just spoiled it a little bit. I think it was what I was just alluding to, which is the fact that some of the most important things that we do for clients, or some of the most important moving pieces, are the simple things. It's, hey, did you get your insurance? Do you track how much money comes in and how much money comes out? Have you had the necessary but difficult conversations with yourself and your family? Those are all things that we know we should do and are rather simple things to do, but that does not make them easy things to do. And more often than not, clients can have the RSUs and the high salary and the business and the moving pieces that add a ton of complexity. And at the end of the day, if they haven't figured out some of the more simple things, they still need to be done. And they're still of equal, if not greater importance than some of the other aspects of their plan.
As the observation goes, knowledge is not the same thing as application. If knowledge was the same thing as application, we'd all be super fit, super healthy, and super rich. And yet, it remains a challenge. The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.